Pedalboard 103. I'm at the point now where I've attached the pedals to the pedal board. I'll put the links in the description down below how I've got to this point in terms of choosing where they're going to be, but we'll talk about how I've attached them and how I've connected them together and powered them up in this video. So the first thing to note is, in my previous video I mentioned my channel select foot switch, which still hasn't been modified. This has got a cable, nasty horrible cable attached to it, which I don't want. I'm going to change that. So just to make things simpler, I'm going to just remove that channel select foot switch just to keep things nice and simple and tidy. This is completely separate and independent from all the other connections on the board. This goes straight to my amplifier. There's no guitar signal or anything going through this pedal. So to begin with, I'm just going to pull this one off because it's velcroed on, and that's going to lead me nicely into how I've attached the pedals to the board. So I'll just unvelcro that and take it away to one side. Now, in terms of sticking the pedals to the board, as I just mentioned, I've used Velcro or hook and loop fasteners, as they should properly be called. Velcro is a trade name. I hope I've not infringed that. So I've connected, I've stuck Velcro strips to my pedal board, and I've stuck the opposite end of the Velcro, the hook and loops, to the back of the pedals so they stick together when you press them onto one another. Now, in this instance, the hook and loop fasteners, the Velcro, came with this pedal board. There was plenty of it, and it was nicely sized, so it nicely stuck across these slots on the board. So more or less the entire pedal board is covered with the hook and loop fasteners. There was an equal amount of either side of the fasteners, the hooks and loops, so I had plenty to put on the back of the pedals as well. Now, in terms of, I mean, it's a fairly simple thing. I just cut it to length and stuck it on these slats. What I've decided to do, the way that I've done it, is the hook, like the plasticky bit of the hook and loop fasteners, I've used that on the pedal board, and the softer fluffy bit I've put on the backs of the pedals. You can do it either way, and obviously it'll stick just as well, but the reason I've decided to do it this way is so that if I want to, for example, take one of the pedals off my board and just use it on its own with my amplifier without the rest of this equipment set up, and I want to put it on the floor. My floor is carpet, as are most floors. Now if I put the hook grippy bit of the Velcro on the back of the pedal, then my pedals are going to stick to the floor, and it's going to pick up fluff from the carpet, and it's just going to not be a very good outcome. So I decided to do it that way so that I can remove the pedals and use them independently without them sticking to the floor when I don't want them to, and without them picking up all the crap from the carpet. So I've gone with the plasticky hooks on the board and the fluffy bits on the back of the pedals. So that's the main method I've used to stick the pedals onto the board. I've also used some cable ties to tidy up the cabling on the board, just so I've not got cables flying around here, there and everywhere, and potentially getting stood on and trapped in between places like that. Particularly, I'll show you the other side of this in later on the video, when I've got my cables for the power supply for the pedals. Now, when it comes to the cabling, my signal, as we call it, the sound that passes from my guitar through all of this in whichever way it's going to work, and to my amplifier, I've got it set in a particular way. As I've mentioned before, this isn't the only way, but this is the way that I've decided to do it. So what happens here is that my guitar, I'm going to connect to a guitar cable, and then that's going to connect here into my tuner. That's the first thing that happens. My guitar goes into my tuner. So I've mentioned the tuner before in a previous video, but whenever I use the tuner, it mutes everything else, so that when I'm doing my ding 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 tuning, that doesn't come through the speakers, which is particularly useful if you're playing in a live environment. You don't want everyone listening to tuning up. So it goes into my tuner first. Out of my tuner, I've got a short little cable going into my wah-wah pedal. That's the next thing in my signal chain, as we call it. So tuner, wah-wah pedal, and then out of the wah-wah pedal I've got a longer cable that's going to go into the input on my amplifier, which is where you'd normally plug your guitar in. So that's where we're up to at the minute. I've got a socket there where I'm going to connect a cable whenever I hook this up that goes into my amplifier. Now the other pedals, these 3 MXR pedals, they're going to go, as I've mentioned in a previous video, in the effects loop of the amplifier. So rather than being plugged into the input, they're plugged into a specific connection that's on the back of the amplifier called an effects loop. There's reasons for doing that. Some effects pedals sound better when they're used in the input of the amplifier, so like my wah wah pedal, that's going to sound better in the input of the amplifier. These pedals, particularly these two, the delay and chorus, they always sound better in the effects loop of the amplifier if you've got an effects loop. The boost pedal, that can be used either way depending on how you want to use it. I'm using mine as a volume boost, not as a gain boost, so that's going in the effects loop of the amplifier. So all these three are getting connected separately into the amplifier. So once I've gone with my wah wah pedal with a cable to my amplifier, I've got another cable coming out the back of my amplifier that's going to go into one of these pedals, whichever order I've chosen to do it. In my case, it's going to go into the chorus pedal first. So I'm coming out of my amplifier with a cable into here, into the chorus pedal. These 3 pedals are then connected together with shorter cables. This one's a bit longer than what I want, but I've not finished setting up yet, so it's just there because it works. Once I've got this finalised, it's going to be tidier than that. And then it goes into my delay pedal, and then into my boost pedal. Out of my boost pedal, I've got another longer cable going back into the effects loop, return of the amplifier, and that's my entire signal chain done. It sounds a bit complicated because I'm going into that, and then into the amplifier, out the amplifier, into that, and back into the amplifier. But this is one of the things that you need to consider when you're setting up a pedal board with different types of effects. You can do it lots of other different ways. You can use these in front of the amplifier. You can use it any way you want to use it, whatever sounds best to you. This is what I've decided to do for me and what works for me. By all means, experiment, play with different settings, play with different ways of connecting them, and see what works for you. So that's my signal, and that's how the sound from a guitar gets through this stuff into the amplifier. Now, just a quick word on the connecting these things together. We're going to use cables, obviously. We're used to using a guitar cable to connect our guitar to our amplifier. If we're an electric guitar player, obviously acoustic players, you might not be familiar with that, but we use cables, and I'm using cables to connect all these things together and to and from my amplifier. Now, one thing with cables is, 2 things with cables is that I'm going to mention, is length. Now, you don't want your cables to be any longer than what they really need to be. On the board itself, I've tried to keep them super short so that I've not got coils and coils of cables everywhere. I've got these little tiny interconnect cables going on here and here. This one, I've not got the perfect size yet, but I'm going to get a better size of that in the future when I'm more comfortable with my setup. But I'm trying to keep my cables as short as possible. Even the cables that are running between this and the amplifier, if I'm just playing at home, if I'm just playing here, you can see my amplifiers there. I probably only need a couple of meters of cables to connect the two together, and that's what I would use ideally. Don't go out and buy the longest cables off the rack just because you think, oh well, one day I might need 50 meters of cable. The reason for that is, the longer your cable is, the more chance you've got of your signal degrading and sounding worse. So a shorter cable gives you a better sound in a nutshell. The second point is, and it's somewhat related to that, is the quality of the cables that you buy. Now, cables come at all different types of costs and quality points. Okay, let's look at the opposite ends of the scale. You can go onto eBay, online, whatever, buy a cheap cable for probably £1 or less, and you'll be able to hear your guitar plugged into your amp, no problem. You'll hear it. At the other end of the scale, you can pay a ridiculous amount of money for audio cables and guitar cables. You may or may not be aware you can spend over You can actually spend over £1,000 on a guitar cable, which is absolutely ridiculous. I'd never consider doing that. I can't imagine the thought process of someone that would want to do that unless they're giving them for free. But I'd never spend that sort of money on a guitar cable. What would I suggest buying? Well, I'm not going to recommend any particular brands of cables, but my suggestion would be avoid the very, very cheapest ones, because they're probably going to be a quality issue there. Not always, but just from experience, if you're buying something for like £1 or £2 or something like that, it's probably not going to be up to scratch. If just a slight step up from there, I would suggest buying a branded cable by a company that is established and either makes cables or makes guitar equipment. There's a few out there, so I'm not going to name the individual ones because there's loads of them out there. Have a bit of a search, have a Google or whatever, have a look at reviews, top 10 reasonably priced guitar cables, and you'll find that you can spend a few quid, not £1,000, and get a decent quality cable, and that'll see you through for connecting your pedals and connecting your guitar to the amplifier. So don't go stupid on price, spending thousands on cables, and don't buy the cheapest, nastiest ones, because they'll probably, even if they sound good to start with, they might deteriorate or get damaged or break over time. So just be sensible with your cables. Apart from, I'm talking about signal cables here, apart from that, the other aspect of what I've connected up here is the power connections. Now that I've removed the amp switching pedal, that doesn't need power anyway, so again, that's a completely separate thing. Everything else on this board needs power to it, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pedals that need power to it. Now, the simplest way to do that, they all accept a 9-volt battery. I think it's called PP3 or something like that, but one of those rectangular 9-volt batteries. So that's going to be the cheapest way to get you started as well, is using batteries. There's a couple of problems there. One problem is when I'm using the pedal board, I've got the pedals attached to the board using the hook and loop fasteners. The compartments to take the batteries are on the back of the pedals. So if I want to change a battery, I've got to take the pedal off the board, and then I've got to go into the back of the pedal, probably unscrew it and put the new battery in. That also affects how I'm fitting the hook and loops onto the back of the pedals. On these, because I'm not using batteries, I've just stuck a great big fat piece of Velcro hook and loop right over the back of the pedal, knowing that I'm not going to open it, so I can stick it down nice and firmly. If you were using the battery compartment, you'd have to leave a space or do a little cutout so that you could still access the battery compartment if you're going to use pedals. So convenience wise, the battery is less convenient when you've got a few pedals on a board. Cost wise, those 9-volt batteries, they're not cheap. I had a quick look. The cheapest I can find them for at a decent brand like a Duracell or whatever is about £3 each now. I've got 5 pedals, so that's £15 in batteries just to begin with, and they're not rechargeable batteries. They'll, when they run out, they run out. From experience, when I've used batteries with pedals before, I've tended to get maybe 2, 3, 4 gigs or rehearsals out of them before they start running down a little bit. So you're going to be changing your batteries quite a lot, and so £15 for a full battery change. By the time I've changed batteries 3 times on these pedals, I'm looking at £45. My power supply cost me £50. So at that point I thought, well, it's going to be more cost effective for me to use a power supply. It's going to become more convenient, and I'm not just going to be messing about pulling the pedals off and having to change the batteries. Now with a power supply, I'll just spin this round so you can see. I've got my power supply, that's this little guy here. I've cable tied that to the underside of the board, and I've got the mains connection for that. I've not got connected at the minute, so I can just plug that in and out whenever I put my pedal board down. But all the other connections here, they're connected permanently to my pedals, so that all I have to do is connect my my mains to the plug socket, and then all my pedals are powered up. I've tried to tidy them up a little bit with the cable ties. I say I've not finished with my positioning 100% yet, so this isn't exactly how it's going to be, but I've just tried to make it so they're not flapping around anywhere. They're not going to get caught, they're not going to get dragged and pulled out. when I'm setting this thing up and breaking it down. The final point to mention with the cabling, both the signal cables and the power supply, they don't like to live very close together. So you want to try and keep them as far apart as you reasonably can. That's the reason why I've put my signal cables, my guitar sound cables on the top of the board, as you can see, and my power cables I've kept underneath the bottom of the board, so they're not next to each other and they're not causing interference, which is what will happen if they're too close together. The worst thing you can have is a signal cable running alongside a power cable. That's the very worst thing you can have. So what I've tried to do is to, as I said, separate them as much as possible. If they have to get close to each other or cross over each other, you want to try and do it in a crossover rather than having them run beside each other like that. So power on the back, signal on the front, and try to keep it as tidy as possible. We've got the hook and loops, the Velcro, so that I can move the pedals around if I need to later. So that's where we're at now. These will probably move. It will definitely get tidier. The amp switcher pedal will get modified so that it's tidier, and the whole thing will get better and better. But we're on the board, we're connected up with signal, we're connected up with power, so all I need to do is, when I want to use this, I can just put it down, run the cables to my amp, to my guitar, plug in the power supply, and I'm good to go. So we're making progress and we're getting there, and more importantly than that, we're going to enjoy.